Okay, so what we're going to kind of cover with this is essentially there's two things. What is palm oil and sustainability trends. So, what is palm oil? We all know the tree, and everybody's heard of the oil. But the way the tree and the product gets into the market is essentially through the fruits. So the fruit will be hauled by the harvesters. It will be then collected and then eventually taken to the mill. Um, the fruit is crushed, and this gives us crude palm oil. What I guess I haven't put here is then the kernel shells are also crushed into an oil, and that's known as palm kernel oil. And eventually it gets shipped somewhere in the world to end up as different products. And this slide is actually kind of important because it kind of shows you the different end uses of palm oil. And it's not just oil, which is it's closer to CPO, but a lot of the other products are actually coming from the palm kernel oil, and that's kind of covered in these other uses, which is in either oleochemicals in the form of soaps and detergents, etc. Then you've got creamers, which I think is also from the palm kernel end. And then in more recent times, there's another use of palm oil, which is essentially biodiesel. Um, but I'm not sure. On your side, are you seeing my control panel? I guess not. Okay. Um, so moving along. So some of the trends that we can see. Palm oil is essentially grown in a few core tropical countries, but Malaysia and Indonesia is probably the largest production of it. If we are to look at the trends over the last, say, 20, 30 years, you would find that palm oil only overtook soybean probably in the year 2000 in terms of the amount of production that was available. But the 90s onwards saw a rapid increase in the amount of palm oil that was actually cultivated. And this trend seems to be continuing to some extent. Um, and you'll also see the price differentials over time. And you're sort of seeing in the low periods of the 90s, palm oil was around 200 to, well, under USD 300 per ton, compared to where we are now, which is around 800 USD. Obviously, there's been a price dip, but compared to the 90s, we have seen a significant price increase. So people are saying that people plant palm oil because you can actually make more money, or you can make money. So this seems to be the reason why palm oil is being planted. Um, and in terms of where palm oil can be planted, it's going to be only in the tropics. Malaysia, Indonesia has seen, like I said, like the largest increase in palm oil production. But what you're actually looking at is there's an increase in plantation-sized palm oil. So larger companies coming in to develop very large areas of land. Whereas traditionally, say, for example, in Africa, it has been a smallholder crop. But we see a similar trend happening in South America, where larger companies are also coming in, and they are on this sort of oil palm expansion. And where the concern comes in is that most of the areas where palm is produced are also what they call kind of high biodiversity areas. So these are essentially tropical rainforests. So this is really where the sort of main kind of concern amongst NGOs and others, that palm oil as a product isn't very sustainable because it's displacing tropical rainforests. So this is kind of where the whole attention on palm oil has been. And what we see today is there's campaigns against palm oil all the time. But I think what I've seen is this is the trend which has been ongoing since the 80s. There's been lobby groups against logging or forestry, and now that's just shifted to palm oil because a lot of the areas which were previously under forest is now palm oil. If you do a Google search, palm oil isn't, you're only going to get a few factual things, and everything else is going to be critical. So in the last 10 or 20 years, the palm oil lobbyists, the pro palm people, have actually been doing a bad job. So if you want to get across this story that palm oil is good and it's good for the world and it's good for everybody, that is kind of like a lost cause right now. And the pressure is on. Increasingly, you're having NGO groups who are scrutinizing, palm oil producers, and this has been the main reason why groups like Wilmar have been challenged a lot, and they still are. This week, we talked to WWF Germany, and they said that Wilmar for them is actually a very difficult brand to be associated with because they have very bad publicity in Germany. So that's interesting, considering that most of our work seems to be with Wilmar right now. Then you're seeing one of the big trends, which is countries are rallying together and making commitments to support not RSPO, but just certified palm oil. I mean, so basically these countries are saying, we want to make sure that our palm oil comes from, sort of non-risky sources or in some ways they're saying that certified palm oil is better, but they aren't saying whether it's going to be responsible. I mean, whether it's RSPO, they may also be accepting other claims, for example, ISCC, which is another sort of standard for a different purpose. So apart from NGO pressure, you get countries are moving forward. And this is not just Netherlands. I mean, Netherlands, Belgium, France, a few other countries have all made these commitments. And what I didn't know was the reason why Unilever's stand for zero deforestation was so vocal was actually because this was part of another group of discussions which came from the Consumer Goods Forum, which is where all the big brands like Marks and Spencers and some of the Unilevers, etc., all get together and meet. And they've been very explicit on a zero deforestation stand. And at the same time, they've been pushing for as kind of like a no labor issue, and especially forced labor and child labor. The no peatlands things is a very specific thing to the sort of palm oil history. But generally, I think what's happening is this banner of zero deforestation seems to be kind of growing amongst many of these big brands, and is especially so if you're a brand that's going to be using palm oil. So one of the outcomes is Wilmar. So Wilmar's also made a similar stand, and now we find St. Darby, KLK, IOI, I think, have all made a similar stand, and that's actually because of the sort of pressure that's also coming from the groups like Greenpeace, because they're working on the sort of consumer facing brands, like your Nestle's and General Mills, etc. So what's happening is the more pressure they're putting on these guys, the more pressure they're putting on their suppliers, but also they themselves are having to make these zero deforestation kind of pledges or policies. So this is really what we hear today, and this is very much the case. Why almost daily or monthly you kind of see new companies making these zero deforestation plans. So, in terms of a sort of conclusion, RSPO is seen as a very high standard, but increasingly it's becoming quite obvious that it's not going to be something that everyone's going to be able to meet. And it is going to be only relevant to perhaps some of the larger players. Banks like HSBC are making it a requirement as part of their lending, but this just means that a lot of smaller guys are basically running away. There are going to be other standards popping in, MSPO, etc. But in terms of requirements, it's actually going to be very much up to a business-to-business association. Because not everybody is requiring RSPO, not everybody is saying MSPO, so it really depends on who your customers are and if they're actually asking for these things. It's possible they're not asking for any of these things, in which case, I guess that's why some companies don't move at all. There is a pressure on the big brands, but basically what this is forcing everybody to do is to identify where their source is coming from. And it's one of the first steps towards traceability. So traceability means I know where my source is coming from, but it also means I know more about my supplier because I understand whether they are actively opening up new land, which is forest land. I know that my suppliers don't have labor issues, basically all the risks that the big brands are kind of worried about. And that's essentially, so traceability has those two steps. There's the know your source, but it's also about knowing the risk those suppliers pose to you and ultimately your customers. So that in a nutshell is that's the backdrop to what is happening currently in the sort of palm oil space.